Alright, hey guys, I want to say thanks to Tony and Dr. Jones and everybody who helped put this on. And yeah, so I'm going to be talking about a larger project, and it's a work in progress right now, so that'll excuse any mistakes I make. So here we go. The late 1970s left New York City and rock music in deteriorating and dispersing conditions. The rock genre introduced a number of diverging subcategories and styles, from folk rock to bubblegum rock to acid rock to metal. One subgenre, punk rock, however, seemingly held its own distinct place in the patchwork of music that began fraying at its seams. As a Lawrence Journal World writer noted in 1977, quote, "Punk rock has all the makings of a musical wasteland, nurturing all that is tasteless to even the most open-minded," end quote. Perhaps fittingly, New York, known as the birthplace of punk, likewise conveyed the image of a wasteland, while alternatively nurturing all that was tasteful to the most business-minded. After financial institutions refused to continue loaning money to New York City, President Gerald Ford further stumped the city by rejecting a federal bailout, as New York became, through the eyes of conservative politicians and wealthy businessmen, a haven for lazy welfare cheats, liberal intellectuals, unproductive union workers, and morally depraved mischief makers. Consequently, in the wake of economic crisis, conservative economic principles and business elites headed the charge in streamlining the city while snobbishly blaming welfare fraud on overpaid municipal workers. Reprivatizing the economy thus became the answer to the city's mess, as only those who could afford to keep the city afloat, bankers and businessmen, took the reins, forcing welfare and social interest advocates to take a backseat. The 1970s and 1980s thus hosted two dark clouds that loomed over the city's populace: the real threat of modern economic failure and the potential for punk to infiltrate young minds with its perceived reverence for nihilism. The intersection of punk and urban deterioration in New York City at the end of the 1970s and then the start of the 1980s impels a long overlooked investigation. What, if any, influence did the city's economic decline have on a new wave of punk rockers? And how did such an influence play out in punk subcultural settings? This presentation grapples with these questions by drawing a direct correlation between city streets and subcultural space. The state of the city precariously presented members of the hardcore punk scene with critical lyrical content that rallied against social conditions, while the city offered space in which hardcore members attempted to disassociate from larger cultural mores. Most emphatically, I contend that the creation of a hardcore punk subculture faced challenges at every turn by its inability to remove itself from the city in which it formed. In this context, the dynamics of gender, above all else, display the scene's complexities and contradictions. Indeed, the masculinity illuminated by imagery, dancing in the form of slamming, and lyrics did more to recreate gender norms, gender customs identified within a larger societal context than to disrupt them. While the subculture's members purportedly advocated a subcultural space that defined the city fraught with deprivation through inclusiveness, in practice, hardcore punk's venerable goals could not escape the city's structural challenges. Existence in Manhattan's Lower East Side, hardcore punk's self-described home, necessitated a degree of strength, requiring the subculture to conform to the standard. New York's structural challenges to inclusivity draw a distinction between hardcore's mental space, revolving around inclusion, and the hyper-masculine physical space exemplified by the venues in which distinctly hardcore rituals played out. Characterized as a wasteland, New York and its urban strife impelled hardcore members to recreate the hyper-masculine identity expected outside of hardcore's venues and squats. The infiltration of hyper-masculinity in the scene consequently resulted in hardcore as a site of male hegemony in which distinctly hardcore roles, such as playing in bands and slam dancing, became homogeneously gendered. In October 1975, the New York Daily News famously contextualized the implications of President Ford's decision to refuse bailing out New York City with the headline, quote, "Ford to city, drop dead." Ford's impassiveness reflected a national climate of inflation fear above concern for unemployment, and thus signified a desire to rein in federal spending as considered an economic solution to both fiscal and social concerns. However, the mysterious hand of the free market did more to benefit big business than to resolve inner-city strife. Tax incentives offered to businesses in the hopes of restructuring the city encouraged a deteriorating quality of life for residents and the decline of municipal infrastructure. As economist William Tapp proclaims, while the gap between private and public interest widened, quote, the government financed its own crisis, not by accommodating the poor, but by serving the rich, end quote. And 600,000 jobs were lost in the city, and as the number of teachers declined by 25% during the 1970s. New York, and the Lower East Side particularly, began a downward spiral, with austerity measures further establishing cuts in the city's notoriously corrupt police force. The Lower East Side became a hospitable environment for drugs and violent crime. However, urban neglect inspired more than mere crime and free flow of drugs. New York's damaged setting also provoked a new breed of punk, relinquishing itself from the frills of punk's predecessors. Hardcore punk, characterized by a louder, faster, more aggressive sound and style, offered inner-city youth an alternative to the city's norms that the subculture recognized as incompatible with a socially conscious scene. Hardcore punks in New York felt that similar to the apathy stimulated by drugs on the streets of the Lower East Side, their punk predecessors overlooked the interests of their fans and depended on often trivial lyrical content and a lifestyle centered on drug use. As Roger Murray of New York hardcore band Agnostic Front put it, quote, we started using the term hardcore because we wanted to separate ourselves from the druggy, aimless punk scene that was happening at the time, end quote. Members of the hardcore scene asserted that while punk intended to disassociate from the norms of youth culture, it ultimately failed. Though punks might have dressed differently and condemned social mores, the new generation saw through the facade. Mohawks and leather jackets were meaningless. Punks acted in accordance with their non-punk peers, while the music industry commodified the punk style. There was nothing rebellious about sex, drugs, and rock and roll anymore. It was being sold to the public on a mass scale. In the midst of New York's urban decline, hardcore punk necessitated rebellion from a new front, one that constructed subcultural identity through reclamation of urban space in defiance of municipal deterioration as perpetuated by corporate stranglehold. As an urban reclamation effort, while facing systemic challenges, hardcore in the city emphasized inclusiveness. As put by Jack Rabbit, a member of the early New York hardcore scene, quote, hardcore was this club where no one ever took membership, and there is no barrier to entry. The fact of you being there meant you were accepted, end quote. Inclusion allowed involvement to expand, while purportedly offering a space for identity construction to members who felt unwelcome anywhere else. However, the construction of New York hardcore subcultural space necessitated recognition of the larger society in which it formed. As put by John Porcelli, member of multiple New York hardcore bands, quote, being a hardcore punk during the heyday of the CBGB's era meant it was you against the world. Cops, hip-hop kids, and drug dealers basically wanted you out, and you had to be hard to survive those days. It influenced the sound and also brought the scene together because we just had each other back then, end quote. Thus, to secure its recognition in an environment attuned to violence, hardcore stressed physical strength. Consequently, New York hardcore necessarily played into the structural elements of larger culture by emphasizing masculinity and providing a setting for young men to display their mannishness while professionally participating in a rebellion against the cultural mores beyond the scene's venues. As the scene defined itself by a sense of inclusivity, it also required an element of toughness as a safeguard to rebellion in the Lower East Side, where strength determined clout. Thus, hardcore's inclusive ethos did not materialize into the physical space the subculture occupied. Bree Hurley's photographs and her experiences perhaps best exemplify the contradictions between the idealized inclusivity New York hardcore purported and the actual space the subculture established as its own. When Hurley began capturing images of New York City hardcore punks outside of CBGB, though unfamiliar with hardcore, she became attracted to the scene's sense of community and openness. Hurley's photographs often display warm smiles on dirty kids as they perceive themselves, against a backdrop of urban decay. The subjects of Hurley's images accordingly for an inclusive scene depict an eclectic group of hardcore punks, from skinhead women with Chelsea haircuts to the average teen with cutoff shorts and a t-shirt. Echoing Rabbit's assertion that the fact of you being there meant you were accepted, Hurley found that the inclusiveness of the scene, quote, imparts a strong sense of belonging and intensifies members' everyday lives, end quote. Intending to capture this through her images, Hurley recognized that the formation of a community, more than the music sound or style, that existed independent and counter to larger cultural norms in the midst of New York's fiscal crisis, signified the most important element of hardcore in the city. However, the distinction between hardcore as an inclusive community and hardcore as a musical sound and style signifies the discrepancies between the subculture's mental space and its manifesting hardcore physical space. Images of hardcore members taken while outside the scene venues do little to reflect the subculture as it passed through venue doors and engaged in distinctly hardcore rituals that solidified a cult of masculinity. The subculture's rituals, such as playing in bands and slam dancing, played the precarious role of exemplifying community while also constructing a space with restrictions on inclusivity. As the violence witnessed in the streets of New York impelled hardcore members to construct a masculine identity that competed for contested urban space, and show flyers and album covers revealed, New York hardcore glorified the meanest and most masculine slam dancer who entered the dance floor. Agnostic Front's cover art for their album Cause for Alarm, for instance, exposes the idealized, menacing look hardcore promoted. It displays the devil as a skinhead, not in opposition to skinheads, but as a representation of justice being served. In hell, the businessman, drug addict, and street criminal answer to a hyper-masculine skinhead. Likewise, show flyers. I should also mention that skinheads involved in hardcore in New York generally were not racist and were critical of other skinheads who likely weren't involved in hardcore. The racist skinheads usually weren't involved in the scene. Likewise, show flyers displayed the hyper-masculine arena of the Pit, hardcore's dance floor. The Pit offered a space for hardcore members to perform distinctly hardcore acts, solidify a sense of community, and assert their masculinity through slam dancing. While slam dancing often resembled violence, members recognized it as both unifying and unique to their community. Members also did not make violence the purpose of entering the Pit. If a member fell, others would quickly pick that member up. If a member got hurt, others made sure that the hurt member made it out of the Pit. As scene member Kevin Crawley recalls, quote, "The pits could be crazy, but no one was ever sitting there waiting to do something to someone. If some jerk-off was standing on the sidelines punching people, that was the guy who ended up getting beat up," end quote. Nonetheless, the Pit also offered an opportunity for members to display their mannishness in a space in which the macho slam dancer garnered the most respect, a necessary ritual for a scene that glorified hegemonic masculinity. Consequently, as artistic representations of the hardcore scene and slam dancing revealed, the scene idealized a homogeneous masculine skinhead form that limited members who did not adhere to the scene's norms. Furthermore, lyrical content played a role in inhibiting result between hardcore as a mental space and the subcultural's physical arena. While the chaos of the hardcore dance floor embodied the staccato nature of the music, lyrics ensured the music retained both the ideals of inclusivity and the reality of hypermasculinity. Seminal New York hardcore bands such as Agnostic Front and Warzone made unity within the hardcore scene central themes to many of their songs. As put by Agnostic Front bassist Diego Casalinas, quote, "We always preach unity. We gotta stick together, or else we're defeating our purpose." Venerable calls for unity within the scene's well-defined physical space, however, did little to promote unity and inclusion beyond the dance floor. Consequently, hypermasculine gender roles as a model for hardcore membership left little room for gender alternatives and a purportedly inclusive and welcoming scene. In fact, hardcore closely resembled society's traditional gender binary through male hegemony. While most hardcore members shared the ideal that women's involvement should include them from moving from backup singers to musicians and from groupies to participants, hardcore imagery excluded them, and they almost never entered the dance floor. I'll get to my conclusion here. At the end of the 1970s and at the start of the 1980s, as New York City's economy attempted to rebuild itself through corporate handouts, a new era of punk galvanized kids who attempted to reject criminal drug-infused norms of a section of the city left for dead in the hands of banking and business elites. Urban dwellings left abandoned as municipal funding and the city's population decline became both a symbol of hardcore's call to unite inner city youth and a space for subcultural occupation. Hardcore thus necessarily depended to some degree on the city's conditioning and could not subsequently evade social norms intended to subvert. While the scene rallied behind a call for inclusivity and unity in defiance of inner city vices, it could not relinquish itself from the masculinity that characterized the urban decline within New York City. While Brie Hurley's images of socializing outside CBGB and songs emphasizing unity seemingly displayed the goals of hardcore inclusivity, the actual space in which hardcore participated in distinctly hardcore rituals and glorified hypermasculine embodiment, and the glorified hypermasculine embodiment of hardcore challenged inclusive aims by creating a hegemonic image of the subculture's members, fitting for the city in which it emanated.